Good to see you, everybody. Welcome back to the second of my 3 presentations on my beloved South Africa. It's a well, I think it's been interesting for me to hear some of your reactions from the first presentation. I'm always interested in hearing comments. Yeah, what a variety of comments and issues raised regarding these presentations. I do urge you to come to all 3, not just because the exam necessitates you come to all 3, but the third talk really sets the first 2 into some sort of modern day context. And I always think when you're dealing with history, whether it's the 300 years we had in the first talk, by the way, that's a semester course, that one yesterday, that's a semester course all in one 45-minute slot. The one today, of course, is a little more challenging, but it's a much shorter period of time, really the 1948 to 1994 period, and a much more recent period of time during which I lived through much of what I'm going to tell you. But the one after Cape Town is really the one that will look at some of these historical features and assess really, what does it say for South Africa? What kind of path does it set South Africa on? And is the current day South Africa really living up to the promise? And I'll talk a little bit about that also towards the end of this particular talk. So again, if you want to sort of, I suppose, a comprehensive overview, and I'm not the last word on the topic, I might add, your taxi driver or your bus driver will be the last word on any topic relating to what's happening in the country right now. So whatever I say, no doubt, a shuttle bus driver will tell you the opposite. So, I always say, take everything with a pinch of salt, in a sense, as to where it comes from. But I've worked in this field for a long time, studied the field as well, and hopefully what I say will have some resonance with you. Now, again, I show the picture of my hometown. Those of us who come from Cape Town, you had that very fine overview of what to do in Cape Town earlier this morning. Those of us who come from Cape Town are very protective about our city. We really don't want to hear anything bad about it. But of course, Cape Town, I have to tell you, just like my talks about South Africa, and by now you already know that South Africa is a complex country with a complex history, so the city of Cape Town also is a complex city. It's got a variety of different demographic groups, many of them still living in areas where they were originally designated where they should live. And that also changes the complexion of Cape Town, and it applies also in many of our other major cities as well. In many instances, our cities, yes, we are now fully integrated from a legislative point of view, but people were designated certain areas in which to live depending on their racial groups. And in many cases, people haven't moved away from those particular areas, largely for economic reasons more than anything else, because of course you can live wherever you want to now in South Africa. But when you go through our cities and you look to see how they comprised in particular, much of the sort of suburban infrastructure still harks back to the period that I'm going to talk to you about right now, and also harks back to some of the apartheid or legislative frameworks that really forced people to live in certain parts of the city. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is not just academic, I might add. It really does touch the lives of South Africans very much still today, despite the fact that we have moved on. Or have we moved on? And that'll be the topic of that third presentation. What I tried to convey in that talk that I did yesterday, the semester in 40 minutes talk, was 3 critical issues that set the scene for modern day South Africa. The isolation of white immigrants or white settlers at the Cape and then moving into the interior of the country, isolated thinking, fear of a large majority of black South Africans. That fear continued through to the discovery of mines and minerals, where the key issue there was who would control the riches within South Africa, and how would a more skittish or nervous white minority protect themselves when it came to jobs, particularly in these new mining cities that were emerging in the center and to the north of the country. I spoke a bit about the colonial dynamics between the original Dutch settlers and then the later British administrators, and how the British ultimately when they won that victory in the South African War, the 1899 to 1902 South African War, the British were relatively happy to work with the Afrikaners who they had vanquished in order to keep a semblance of control over the broader South Africa. I spoke a little bit yesterday about how those descendants of the Dutch, the Afrikaners, had mobilized themselves very successfully as a community. They'd mobilized themselves financially in order to compete with the English-speaking or British interests, and importantly, they had mobilized themselves politically as well to take over political control from the predominant English speakers, or the welfare of the capitalist classes in South Africa that were the English speakers. And there's a fascinating trajectory of how a relatively small community became so powerful, certainly politically, in that period of the 1930s into the 1940s. So that's what sort of the context for the talk today. And the talk today it's a difficult one for me because it does deal with our rather dark and unpleasant history, I suppose, within the country. But this is part of our psyche. It's part of day-to-day conversation in South Africa. It hasn't gone away in terms of the scars that it has left for many within the country. But there is a debate. There is a debate in South Africa about these days that I'm going to talk to you about, and current South Africa. And there is a debate about whether current South Africa is being able to improve upon what we all lived through in the past. So, it's a difficult one, and you'll encounter some of these issues as you tour around Cape Town or as you engage the locals in conversation, and the locals are going to bend your ear, I might add, with all sorts of issues, good and bad, about Cape Town and about South Africa. So let me begin by just taking you back again to the end of that presentation yesterday. 1948 was a very important year in South African history because there was a change in political party. And this is a very important issue because remember, I know most of you come from the United States, and believe me, I know a lot about the US political system. The US is my second home when it comes to going on vacation. I've been there twice this year, so I know a little bit about how your system works. In South Africa, remember that in 1948, it was only a white electorate who were entitled to vote. And in 1948, the white electorate voted for a conservative nationalist political party called the National Party. They remained in power from 1948 until 1994. 1948 until 1994, South Africa only had one political party in power. There was no turnover in terms of political parties. And I'm a political analyst at heart, and what's very important for all societies, and I'm going to preach on this issue whether you like it or not, is that there is a regular turnover in terms of political parties in control. When there isn't a turnover, political parties get stuck in their ways, they don't listen to the voice of the people, they have remaining in power very often as their key issue. And of course, in our particular case in South Africa, if the electorate do not turf out one political party and replace them with another, there's always the chance that corruption can creep into the political equation. So in South Africa, we had 50 years, just under 50 years or so, of the same political party ruling the country. It started in 1948, and it was the National Party headed up by this gentleman, D.F. Malan, at the time. Now, I spoke to you in the last talk about the promises that this National Party made to a nervous white electorate, the promises that would lead to apartheid, or as it is translated directly, separateness, the separation of the races. I did make the point yesterday, and I'll make the point again, that the ideology was to separate the races. The ideology wasn't to annihilate the different races or the majority. It was to introduce separation, social separation and political separation as far as practically possible. This was the promise made to the nervous electorate. Remember, back in 1920, 1930, the South African demographic had about 70% of the population being black, 70%, with about 20% more or less being white. The demographic change in South Africa just more recently has moved even more in favor of the majority black population. We have now 80% of South Africa's 60 million are black South Africans, and only about 10% are white South Africans. So even in the 20s and 30s, there was a very substantial black majority. But ultimately, the black majority was excluded. They were excluded from ownership of the wealth of the mines, and they were excluded also from political participation in that 1948 election and in all subsequent elections until 1994. So we had in South Africa, and you can say what you like about it, we had 5 or 6 million white South Africans who voted in successive elections all the way until 1994, when we opened, of course, our voters' roll, and the entire South Africa went to the polls in a pretty free and fair, if not slightly chaotic, election in 94. So, it sets the scene, I suppose. So, in that early part of the 1950s, a variety of pieces of legislation were enacted in our parliament in order to give effect to this apartheid or separateness policy. And a lot of it was fairly unpleasant, I must tell you. It was really an attempt to socially distance and differentiate the races within South Africa. There was a prohibition of mixed marriages in South Africa, and every single South African had to be registered in terms of what was called the Population Registration Act. If you were deemed or were registered as a black South African, there were designated areas where you could live. If you were a mixed race or colored South African, there were other areas in which you could live. If you were an Indian or Asian South African, there were other suburban areas in which you could live. And if you were a white South African, there were specific areas for you too. So it was quite an administratively complex type of social control that was implemented in the country during that early part of the 1950s period. And as a result, social amenities were reserved for white South Africans, for black South Africans, for mixed race colored South Africans, for Indian South Africans. You get the idea. And these notices went up in public places in order to designate which area would be, or which facility would be for which population group. I showed this picture because it's a very interesting picture. I'm always interested in cities and how cities develop. It's one of the quite a few areas I like. By the way, I love retail. If any of you want advice on retail, I'll tell you a lot about retail in Cape Town. If I had another life, I'd be in retail. But I'm interested in cities, and I'm interested in urban planning as well. And part of those early days of segregation was to take the maps of all of our various cities and to demarcate which area would be a white area, which area would be a black area, or a colored area. I'm simplifying to a great degree, but you get the idea. That's what this particular picture represents. And in order to achieve a compliance with putting certain racial groups in certain suburban areas, well, you had to forcibly remove the wrong people from a particular area if it had been designated for another population or racial group. And that became known as forced removals, a policy that was particularly hated, of course, by many black South Africans who were uprooted from their homes and often moved to areas of the city very far away from the center or from anywhere close to their particular workspace. You can imagine. I don't have to belabor the point, but all of these various issues clearly they might well have provided the white community with a sense of security, but at the same time, that resentment amongst black South Africans, the vast majority, was beginning to build in the 1950s and then into the 1960s as well. This kind of separation and segregation also extended to our educational system in South Africa, separate schooling for white, colored, black, Indian children. And the amounts of money or government subsidies that were spent on the different racial groups clearly also differed. White kids got the lion's share of educational budgets, and black kids obviously got that much less. When certain jobs were reserved, more highly skilled jobs were reserved for whites, clearly the ideology was that it wasn't as necessary to provide specific types of education in schools, because those black kids would not be entitled to the jobs that would have been reserved for white South Africans. There are a number of quotes from some of our politicians at the time on the issue of this differentiated education. There's a lot of controversy even today about this particular issue and the effects of poorer black education as a result of the apartheid policy for generations, which have led perhaps now to sort of a weak society as a result of this. There's also a fair amount of revisionist history about this particular issue. But I just point out to you that this attempt to socially define communities, giving them different rights, was ultimately the policy of the National Party, and it lasted really from 1948 until the early 1990s. Here are a few photographs of, and some of you, again, coming from parts of the US, will find some resonance in this. Here's a public bus. The black South Africans sat at the back, white South Africans sat at the front. Here's a park bench, which was reserved for Europeans only, and there were no Europeans at the park at the time. So you can see from that rather unpleasant picture, there's the sign written on the bench. I mean, it's pretty crude stuff when you think about it. Here's a public beach. Our beaches were also segregated and separated with a border line between areas that for white South Africans and for black South Africans on the other side. Our post offices had separate entrances for whites and for non-whites. I could go on for that matter. Perhaps one of the most disliked aspects of this apartheid policy was the implementation of an internal passport that black South Africans had to carry. White South Africans didn't have to have this, but black South Africans had to have what was known as a passbook. And this passbook would give them entry into specific areas of the city. If they didn't have this passbook, they could be arrested or they could be forcibly removed from the area that they were in, and there were spot checks by the police. Now, I lived through this. Believe me, I'm not making this up. I saw police vehicles stop people in the streets, and I mean, you can well imagine. You don't need me here to tell you that this clearly became one of the real areas that was at the forefront of galvanizing black resistance against these apartheid policies over the course of the 1950s and